When heavily armed mercenaries breached the doors of the Grand Crest Resort at 2:15 a.m., they expected a flawless operation. They cut the power, jammed the radios, and thought the terrified night manager was completely alone. But as the squad leader stepped into the pitch-black lobby, a deep, vibrating growl echoed from the shadows. They did not know an off-duty Navy SEAL and his 80-pound German Shepherd were sleeping upstairs. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from. And if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The whispering pines of the Blackwood Valley envelop the sprawling structure of the Grand Crest Resort. It was mid-November, the deep off-season, when the vibrant summer crowds had long retreated, leaving the massive timber and glass lodge standing like a solitary fortress against the encroaching winter chill. Inside the main building, the atmosphere was thick with a profound, unbroken quiet. Alice sat behind the expansive mahogany front desk, the faint glow of the computer monitor illuminating her features. Alice was a young woman of 25, with sharp, observant green eyes and dark hair pulled back into a neat, practical ponytail. She wore the standard manager uniform, consisting of a crisp white button-down shirt beneath a charcoal blazer, though tonight she had draped a thick knitted shawl over her shoulders to ward off the draft. As the night manager, she preferred the graveyard shift because it offered her a sense of peace she rarely found elsewhere. She tapped rhythmically on her keyboard, reviewing the sparse guest list. Only 10 rooms were occupied in a resort built to hold 300. The state-of-the-art security system hummed softly in the background, a grid of green lights on the console assuring her that all perimeter doors were locked and alarmed. 3 floors up, in the secluded corner suite, 314, Brad was asleep. Brad was a 32-year-old active-duty Navy SEAL, possessing a lean, heavily muscled frame, built for endurance and survival. He had short-cropped sandy blonde hair and a rugged face, marked by the sun and wind of countless military deployments. He wore only a plain gray T-shirt and dark tactical pants, resting on top of the covers rather than beneath them. He was currently on a mandatory relaxation leave, hiding away under a civilian alias to escape the noise of the world and reset his mind. Lying on the thick rug beside his bed was Titan. Titan was a massive 80-pound German Shepherd with a sleek, jet-black coat and tan markings around his intelligent face and paws. Titan was a retired military working dog, but his instincts were as sharp as the day he left active service. Even in sleep, the dog's ears twitched at the subtle groans of the settling building. The bond between Brad and Titan was forged in high-stress combat zones, operating on a level of mutual understanding that required no verbal commands. The antique grandfather clock in the main lobby chimed exactly 2 a.m. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, bouncing off the massive stone fireplace and the vaulted timber ceilings. Alice stretched her arms overhead, fighting a sudden wave of fatigue that settled behind her eyes. She reached for her cooling cup of coffee, taking a slow sip. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the wind began to howl, sweeping down the narrow valley and throwing handfuls of frozen sleet against the reinforced glass. The resort was entirely isolated, accessible only by a winding 10-mile mountain road that was treacherous even in good weather. Alice glanced at the security cameras on her secondary monitor. The digital feeds showed empty hallways, a deserted parking lot, and the 2 overnight security guards, Marcus and Dave, chatting near the loading dock doors. Everything appeared perfectly normal for a quiet winter night. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the normalcy shattered. The disruption did not begin with noise, but with an absolute, suffocating darkness. Every single light in the Grand Crest Resort extinguished simultaneously. The steady hum of the climate control system died instantly. The grid of green lights on Alice's security console flickered once and vanished into pitch black. Alice froze in her chair, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her mouth. A sudden power outage in the valley was not entirely uncommon during a heavy winter storm, but the heavy-duty backup generators were explicitly designed to engage within 5 seconds of a main grid failure. She counted to 10 in her head. Nothing happened. The heavy, oppressive silence returned to the lobby, now accompanied by the creeping cold from outside. She reached under the front desk for her emergency flashlight, her fingers brushing the cold metal casing. Before she could click the heavy flashlight on, a deafening crash echoed from the front vestibule. It was the distinct, violent sound of reinforced security glass shattering under extreme force. Heavy boots crunched over the broken shards on the tile floor. Alice immediately dropped to her knees, hiding her body behind the solid wood of the reception desk. Her heart slammed frantically against her ribs. She peeked carefully around the edge of the counter. The faint moonlight cutting through the storm clouds revealed terrifying silhouettes entering the building. A group of heavily armed men was moving into the lobby with terrifying synchronized precision. They wore full tactical gear, their faces obscured by dark balaclavas and night vision goggles. They moved silently now, sweeping their suppressed automatic rifles across the room like seasoned professionals. "Secure the perimeter," a low, gruff voice ordered. The leader stepped forward, his night vision gear giving him a monstrous insectoid appearance in the dark. "Find the security room and neutralize the guards. No mistakes." Alice clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle her rapid breathing. 2 of the mercenaries broke off from the main group and headed swiftly toward the service corridor where the guards had been stationed. Less than a minute later, Alice heard the terrible sounds of a brief, brutal struggle. Muffled grunts and the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor reached her ears. The 2 mercenaries returned to the main lobby shortly after, dragging Marcus and Dave along the floor. The guards were bruised and bleeding, their hands swiftly bound behind their backs with thick plastic zip ties. "Communications are jammed," another mercenary reported, tapping a bulky electronic device strapped to his wrist. "The valley is completely cut off. Nobody gets in, nobody gets out." The leader nodded in satisfaction, his masked face turning toward the sweeping grand staircase that led up to the guest rooms. "Good. Lock down all the exits. We control the building now. Start the sweep from the top floor down." Alice pressed her back firmly against the mahogany desk, her mind racing in the dark. The resort was completely locked down. They were trapped miles from civilization with a team of professional killers, and nobody in the outside world knew it had happened. Up in Suite 314, Titan's amber eyes snapped open in the darkness. The German shepherd let out a low, rumbling growl deep in his chest. Brad awoke instantly, his senses shifting from deep sleep to absolute combat readiness in a fraction of a second. The long night was just beginning. The sudden absence of the humming climate control system was the first critical warning. In room 314, Brad lay perfectly still on top of the covers. His eyes rapidly adjusted to the total darkness of the hotel suite. Titan, the large German shepherd, stood by the edge of the bed. The intelligent dog let out a faint, vibrating rumble deep in his throat, a clear signal of an approaching threat. Brad placed a steadying hand firmly on the thick fur of Titan's neck. The dog immediately fell silent, his training overriding his canine instincts. The silence in the Grand Crest Resort was entirely unnatural for a modern building. Brad swung his legs over the side of the bed. His bare feet touched the freezing hardwood floor. He did not turn on his mobile phone or reach for a flashlight. Any source of light meant instant death in a blind, tactical environment. He moved toward the heavy wooden door with measured, completely silent steps. His combat instincts, honed over a decade of intense Navy SEAL deployments, took full control of his mind and body. The quiet vacationer seeking peace and quiet was entirely gone. The highly trained military operator remained in his place. He pressed his ear against the cold surface of his hotel room door and listened intently. The heavy acoustic doors muffled most ambient noise, but he could clearly hear faint, rhythmic thuds coming from the central stairwell at the end of the hall. It was the sound of heavy combat boots making deliberate steps and moving upward. The intruders were clearing the floors systematically. Downstairs in the main lobby, Alice remained completely frozen behind the thick mahogany reception desk. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, echoing in her own ears. She pressed her cold hands tightly over her mouth to muffle her own terrified breathing. Through the narrow gap between the reception desk and the decorative stone wall, she watched the armed men coordinate their assault. The leader of the mercenaries barked concise orders in a low, disciplined voice. These men moved with lethal, practiced efficiency. They were not common thieves or desperate criminals looking for quick cash from the hotel safe. They were a highly coordinated tactical unit. They carried advanced suppressed weaponry and wore unmarked military-grade tactical gear. Alice watched in pure horror as two of the masked men dragged the unconscious bodies of the night security guards into the back office. The sight made her stomach turn violently. She knew she needed to hide immediately. The front desk offered absolutely zero protection if they decided to search the lobby area thoroughly. Alice crawled on her hands and knees across the expensive carpet. She moved slowly toward the heavy oak doors of the administrative suite, located directly behind her workspace. She hoped desperately that the door was unlocked. She reached up and twisted the cold brass handle. It clicked open smoothly. She slipped inside the dark office and closed the door without making a single sound, trapping herself in the pitch-black room. Back on the third floor, Brad stepped back from the door and evaluated his immediate surroundings in the dark. The luxury hotel room offered no defensive advantages whatsoever. The large panoramic windows dropped straight down to a concrete patio 3 stories below, eliminating any chance of a quiet exit. He had no firearms with him. His personal weapons were safely locked in a secure armory back at his naval base in California. He had a standard tactical knife packed in his canvas duffel bag, but bringing a short blade to a gunfight against multiple heavily armored targets was a fatal tactical mistake. He needed a significant advantage, and he needed it immediately. He looked up toward the ceiling. The room featured a large, industrial-sized ventilation grill located near the entrance of the bathroom. It was part of the old architecture of the historic lodge, built wide enough to easily accommodate maintenance workers navigating the building. Brad moved swiftly to his duffel bag on the floor. He retrieved his heavy combat knife and a small red-lens penlight. He gestured silently to the German shepherd. Titan moved instantly to Brad's side, the dog's amber eyes tracking every single movement his handler made. Brad pulled the heavy wooden desk chair directly under the air vent. He stepped onto the chair and carefully examined the metal grill. 4 standard flathead screws held the heavy metal plate in place. Using the flat spine of his tactical knife, Brad began to unscrew the metal fasteners. He worked with practiced speed and precision, catching each screw before it could drop. In the hallway outside his room, the sound of heavy boots grew noticeably louder. The hostile unit had reached the 3rd floor. Brad heard a sharp voice issuing final commands through the thick door. "Check every room, leave no one behind, neutralize any resistance." The voice was calm and entirely authoritative. Brad recognized the specific tone instantly. It was the distinct tone of a professional operator executing a precise, ruthless mission. Brad removed the final screw holding the vent. He caught the heavy metal grill before it could clatter to the floor and set it gently on the soft carpet. He reached up, grabbed the edges of the duct, and pulled his muscular frame up into the dark, dusty ventilation shaft. The enclosed space was tight, built from reinforced sheet metal that echoed slightly. He turned around carefully and reached down toward the dark hotel room. "Tighten up," Brad commanded in a barely audible whisper. The highly trained German shepherd did not hesitate for a second. The dog leaped gracefully from the floor onto the desk chair and then propelled his powerful body upward toward the opening. Brad grabbed the dog firmly by his heavy tactical harness and pulled him completely into the dark shaft. Titan settled immediately beside Brad, pressing his body flat against the cold metal floor of the duct. Brad reached down one last time to grab the metal grill from the carpet. He pulled it up and held it firmly in place over the opening, pulling the edges flush against the ceiling just as heavy footsteps stopped right outside his door. A heavy mechanical breaching tool slammed violently against the locking mechanism of Brad's hotel room door. The expensive electronic lock shattered instantly into pieces. The heavy wooden door kicked open, crashing violently against the interior wall with a deafening thud. Two heavily armed mercenaries stormed into the dark room. Their suppressed rifles were raised tightly to their shoulders, and their mounted flashlights cut blinding bright beams through the darkness. They swept the corners of the room with absolute precision, checking the bathroom and the closet areas first. Brad watched them through the narrow horizontal slits of the ventilation grill, his breathing slowed to a perfectly rhythmic, silent pace. Titan remained perfectly still right beside him, not making a single sound or movement. "Room 314 is clear," one of the mercenaries stated into his headset, his voice muffled by his dark balaclava. "The bed has been slept in. Luggage is still here on the floor. The target might be on the move." The second man replied quickly. "Copy that. Push forward. We need to secure the main server room on the second floor before anyone manages to send out a distress signal. Move out." The two men backed out of the room, their weapons still raised, and moved quickly down the hallway to the next door. Brad waited in the total darkness of the shaft, the smell of dust and old metal filling his nose. He knew the initial room sweep was just the very beginning of the ordeal. The mercenaries had successfully locked down the entire Grand Crest Resort. They completely controlled the exits, the main power grid, and the external communications. But they did not know they were securely locked inside the building with a fully trained Navy SEAL and a combat-tested German Shepherd. Brad released his tight grip on the vent grill. He turned to face the dark, sprawling network of air ducts that ran through the entire massive hotel. The quiet vacation was officially over. It was time to go to work. Down in the expansive main lobby, Vance surveyed his newly acquired territory. Vance was a tall, heavily scarred man in his late 40s, with a shaved head and cold, calculating gray eyes. He wore a fitted black tactical uniform over a heavy Kevlar vest, and his movements possessed the stiff, economical precision of a veteran military contractor who had spent years operating outside the law. He held a customized, suppressed rifle loosely but securely in his right hand. The captured night guards were securely tied and gagged in the back office. The front desk manager was nowhere to be seen, but Vance was not concerned about one frightened civilian. He tapped the communication earpiece lodged in his right ear. "Report," he commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the dark, cavernous space of the lodge. Static crackled briefly before a voice responded. "Second floor secured. We have the server room locked down. Comm lines are physically severed. The third floor team is moving systematically through the guest suites now." Vance nodded to himself. The operation was proceeding exactly according to the strict timeline he had established. "Spread out and check every single maintenance room, storage closet, and laundry chute," Vance ordered his men. "Leave no stone unturned. Our primary target is still unaccounted for. If you find anyone wandering the halls, secure them immediately. If they present any form of resistance, neutralize them without hesitation." The remaining mercenaries in the lobby dispersed rapidly, moving like lethal shadows into the various wings of the Grand Crest Resort. High above the sprawling hallways, Brad and Titan navigated the claustrophobic labyrinth of the hotel ventilation system. The sheet metal duct was barely wide enough for Brad to crawl on his stomach. The air inside was stale, smelling strongly of old dust and cold iron. Total darkness enveloped them, forcing Brad to rely entirely on his spatial awareness and the faint ambient vibrations traveling through the metal structure. Titan crawled smoothly right behind him. The massive German Shepherd moved with an unnatural grace for an animal of his size. During their multiple combat deployments in hostile desert environments, Brad and Titan had spent countless hours operating in confined, pitch-black spaces. Their bond transcended the typical relationship between a handler and a working dog. They communicated perfectly through slight shifts in body weight, subtle changes in breathing patterns, and absolute silence. When Brad stopped moving, Titan stopped moving instantly. The dog knew instinctively that any sound, even the clicking of his claws on the metal, could mean immediate death for both of them. Brad navigated toward a service access panel located above the third-floor maintenance corridor. He peered through the dusty metal louvers. The hallway below was intended only for hotel staff, lined with heavy electrical boxes, laundry chutes, and cleaning supply closets. It was dimly lit by a single battery-powered emergency exit sign that cast a sickly red glow across the linoleum floor. It was the perfect environment for an ambush. Brad carefully unlatched the access panel, easing it open without letting the hinges squeak. He lowered himself silently to the floor, his bare feet making absolutely zero noise on the hard surface. He reached up and helped Titan down. The dog landed softly next to him. Brad drew the heavy tactical knife from his waistband. He knew he could not stay on the defensive forever. To protect the innocent people trapped in the building, he needed to dismantle the mercenary team piece by piece. He needed weapons, he needed a radio to intercept their communications, and he needed to instill fear in their ranks. Brad signaled Titan with 2 quick taps on the shoulder. It was a command to hold position and prepare for a distraction protocol. Titan sat down beside a large metal laundry cart, his intelligent amber eyes fixed on his handler. Brad grabbed a thick braided rope hanging from a nearby laundry chute and pulled himself up into the dark recess above the drop ceiling, positioning himself directly over the center of the narrow hallway. He braced his legs tightly against the structural beams, suspending his body entirely in the dark shadows. Now they just had to wait for the prey to walk into the trap. 10 minutes later, the heavy metal door at the end of the maintenance corridor pushed open slowly. A lone mercenary stepped into the red-lit hallway. He was a broad-shouldered man wearing a dark balaclava, sweeping the area methodically with his suppressed rifle. He moved carefully, his boots placing deliberate weight on the floor to avoid making loud noises. He checked the nearest electrical closet, finding it empty. As the mercenary advanced toward the center of the corridor, Titan initiated the plan. The German shepherd deliberately scraped his heavy front paw against the metal base of the laundry cart. It was a very small, metallic scratching sound, but in the dead silence of the isolated hallway, it was loud enough to instantly draw attention. The mercenary stopped dead in his tracks. He raised his rifle, aiming the barrel directly at the shadows surrounding the laundry cart. "Come out with your hands up," the mercenary whispered harshly, taking 2 cautious steps forward. He peered intensely into the gloom, focusing all of his attention on the area where the sound had originated. He made the fatal mistake of looking down instead of looking up. As the mercenary passed directly underneath the dark recess in the ceiling, Brad dropped from the shadows like a stone. He landed squarely on the man's shoulders, using the downward momentum to drive the mercenary violently to the floor. The suppressed rifle clattered harmlessly out of the man's hands, skidding across the linoleum. Before the mercenary could even register the sudden attack or cry out for help, Brad's arm snapped around his throat in a flawless, inescapable chokehold. Brad locked his muscles tight, applying immense pressure to the carotid arteries on both sides of the man's neck. The mercenary thrashed wildly in panic, his hands clawing desperately at Brad's arm, but the grip was like solid iron. The struggle lasted less than 10 seconds. Deprived of oxygenated blood, the mercenary's eyes rolled back and his body went entirely limp. Brad lowered the unconscious man silently to the floor. He quickly stripped the mercenary of his tactical earpiece and fitted it into his own ear. He picked up the suppressed rifle, checked the loaded chamber, and secured the spare magazines in his pockets. A voice suddenly crackled through the stolen earpiece. "Echo Team, status report. Have you cleared the maintenance wing?" Brad did not press the transmit button. He looked down at Titan, who sat quietly beside the fallen enemy. They had their weapons. They had their communication line. The first hunt was a complete success, and the tide of the night was about to violently turn. Down in the expansive main lobby, the oppressive silence was broken only by the howling wind outside. Vance paced slowly in front of the grand stone fireplace. He checked his heavy tactical watch, noting that 10 full minutes had passed since he ordered the maintenance level sweep. He tapped the communication earpiece lodged in his ear. "Echo Team, report your status," he commanded. Only the soft, rhythmic hiss of static answered him. Vance frowned deeply. His men were elite professionals, drawn from the most ruthless private military sectors. They strictly followed communication protocols, and they absolutely did not miss their scheduled check-ins. "Echo Actual, respond immediately." "This is Actual." Still, there was nothing but dead air. Vance turned to the heavily armed men guarding the front entrance. A cold realization settled over the mercenary leader. They were no longer the only predators operating inside the Grand Crest Resort. Someone else was hunting in the dark corridors. Vance hated unknown variables, and this was a massive one. He adjusted his grip on his customized rifle. "We have a critical situation," he announced to his unit, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Echo Team is down and unresponsive. We have an active, highly capable hostile element inside the perimeter. There will be no more single sweeps. You will move in two-man pairs. Keep your weapons hot. If it moves, and it is not wearing our gear, put a bullet in it immediately." The mercenaries nodded silently, their body language shifting instantly from relaxed confidence to high alert. The simple lockdown operation had just evolved into a lethal combat zone. The tension in the lobby spiked as the hunters realized they were suddenly bleeding numbers. On the ground floor, Alice remained huddled in the dark administrative office. The air grew stale and freezing cold as the building rapidly lost heat. She knew she could not stay hidden under the wooden desk forever. The mercenaries were systematically clearing every single room. It was only a matter of time before they breached the office doors and found her cowering there. She needed to find a much more secure location. She mentally mapped the resort layout and thought of the massive industrial kitchen located directly behind the main dining hall. It featured multiple heavy steel doors, a labyrinth of metal storage racks, and most importantly, access to the reinforced walk-in freezers. The freezers locked heavily from the inside and were built with thick insulated walls that might actually stop a bullet. Alice took a deep, shuddering breath, trying desperately to steady her trembling hands. She pushed herself up from the floor. She slowly opened the office door and peered into the hallway. It was completely empty. She slipped out into the open, keeping her back pressed tightly against the cold plaster wall. She navigated blindly through the dining room. The large wooden tables and high-backed dining chairs looked like giant tombstones in the dim moonlight, filtering through the frosted windows. She reached the heavy double-swinging doors of the kitchen and pushed through them. The kitchen was a massive expanse of stainless steel prep counters, hanging iron pots, and industrial gas ovens. The darkness in this room was absolute, smelling faintly of old cooking oil and metallic surfaces. Alice crawled quietly behind a large central prep station. She huddled her body next to a stack of heavy plastic storage crates. Suddenly, the heavy kitchen doors swung open violently. Two bright, blinding beams of tactical light cut through the thick darkness. The beams swept rapidly across the stainless steel surfaces, creating disorienting reflections all over the walls. Alice squeezed her eyes shut and held her breath, praying she was completely hidden. Two mercenaries stepped into the room. They moved cautiously, strictly covering each other's blind spots with their suppressed rifles. "Check the pantry doors," one mercenary ordered. His heavy boots clicked loudly on the hard tile floor. The second man moved deliberately toward the central prep station where Alice was hiding. Alice felt her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. She backed away slowly, trying to put more distance between herself and the approaching pool of light. Her foot brushed against a metal serving tray, resting forgotten on the floor. The tray slid backward, scraping loudly against the rough tiles. The sound echoed heavily in the quiet room. Both flashlights snapped instantly toward her position, pinning her like a spotlight. "A target spotted in the center," the first mercenary called out coldly. He rounded the metal counter, raising his rifle to his shoulder. Alice was completely cornered. She scrambled backward until her back hit the solid freezing wall of the walk-in freezer. The bright light blinded her vision. She raised her hands defensively in front of her face. "Please," Alice pleaded, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Don't shoot me." The mercenary did not hesitate or show a shred of mercy. He aimed the barrel directly at her chest, his finger tightening steadily on the trigger. He had strict orders from Vance to leave 0 witnesses behind. Before the mercenary could pull the trigger, a massive black shape erupted from the deep shadows directly above the commercial ovens. Titan, the highly trained German Shepherd, launched his 80-pound frame through the air with terrifying speed. The dog crashed violently into the mercenary's chest. Titan's powerful jaws clamped shut with bone-crushing force directly over the man's right wrist. The mercenary screamed in sudden, blinding agony as his hand involuntarily clenched, firing the heavy rifle wildly into the ceiling. The weapon clattered uselessly to the floor. Titan drove the man down hard to the tiles, pinning him with his heavy weight and snarling fiercely inches from his face. The second mercenary spun around in shock, bringing his weapon up quickly to shoot the attacking animal. He never got the chance to fire. Brad materialized entirely from the darkness directly behind him. The Navy SEAL moved with fluid, lethal efficiency. Brad grabbed the barrel of the mercenary's rifle, pushing it forcefully upward and away from his body. Simultaneously, he drove his knee violently into the man's stomach. As the mercenary doubled over, Brad delivered a precise, devastating strike to the base of the man's neck with the edge of his hand. The mercenary collapsed instantly, out cold before he even hit the kitchen floor. Brad scooped up the dropped rifle from the ground. He pointed it directly at the first man, who was still struggling weakly under the massive weight of the German Shepherd. "Titan, out!" Brad commanded in a firm, low tone. The dog released the man's bleeding wrist immediately and stepped back, standing strict guard over the wounded enemy. Brad stepped forward and struck the mercenary across the jaw with the heavy stock of the rifle, knocking him completely unconscious. The large kitchen fell dead silent once again. Brad turned toward Alice. She was sitting rigidly on the floor, staring in absolute shock at the violent scene that had just unfolded in a matter of seconds. Brad lowered the muzzle of his captured weapon. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice entirely calm and steady despite the chaos. Alice shook her head rapidly, unable to find her voice. "I am Brad. This is Titan. We need to move right now. Those wild gunshots will bring the rest of the unit down here in less than a minute." Brad reached out and grabbed Alice by the arm, pulling her firmly but gently to her feet. He looked at the heavy steel door situated directly behind her. It was the entrance to the industrial walk-in freezer. "Open it quickly," he instructed. Alice fumbled with the heavy metal latch with her shaking hands. She pulled the thick door open with a heavy groan of metal. A blast of freezing air immediately hit them in the face. Brad pushed her inside the dark space and followed closely behind her, whistling softly for Titan. The intelligent dog darted smoothly into the cold room. Brad grabbed the heavy interior handle and pulled the thick door completely shut, plunging them back into total darkness just as the main kitchen doors burst open again. The heavy walk-in freezer door shut with a solid thud, enveloping Brad, Alice, and Titan in absolute darkness. The air inside was instantly bone-chilling, biting through their clothes. Brad immediately switched on his small red lens penlight. The dim crimson glow revealed towering rows of frosted meat boxes and frozen vegetables stacked on metal shelves. Brad looked at Alice. She was shivering uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest to conserve whatever warmth she had left. "We cannot stay in here," Brad said quietly, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "The cold will drop our core temperatures to dangerous levels in a matter of minutes. Is there another way out of this kitchen complex?" Alice nodded slowly, her teeth chattering loudly in the quiet space. "There is a heavy service elevator at the back of the prep area," she whispered, pointing toward the far wall. "It leads directly down to the technical basement. The maintenance crews use it to transport heavy industrial equipment. It has a manual override hatch on the top roof if the main power grid is out." Brad moved to the freezer door and pressed his ear against the thick insulated metal. He could clearly hear the muffled shouts of the remaining mercenaries searching the kitchen outside. They sounded angry, frustrated, and completely disorganized after losing 2 more of their men to a single dog and an unarmed man. "Show me the elevator," Brad instructed. Brad slowly pushed the freezer door open just a fraction of an inch to check the immediate area. The kitchen was completely clear of hostiles. He signaled for Alice and Titan to follow him out. They moved silently past the long rows of stainless steel counters, keeping their heads down. Alice led them to a set of heavy double doors painted a dull industrial gray at the far end of the kitchen. Brad pried the outer elevator doors open using the thick blade of his combat knife. The elevator car was stopped perfectly on their floor due to the sudden power outage. Brad climbed up through the emergency roof hatch and helped Alice down into the dark, greasy shaft, then carefully lowered the heavy German Shepherd. They bypassed the stagnant car entirely and climbed down the heavy maintenance ladder mounted to the solid concrete wall. They descended 2 full floors deep into the earth. The air grew progressively warmer and smelled strongly of machine oil, stale water, and damp concrete. They finally reached the basement level. Brad forced the lower doors open with a powerful heave. The technical basement was a massive, cavernous underground space filled with enormous HVAC units, humming industrial water heaters, and thick bundles of colored electrical cables running along the ceiling like giant veins. It was a perfect tactical playground for a man with his specific training. Brad found a secluded corner behind a massive cylindrical water boiler that offered solid cover from the main doorway. He motioned for Alice to sit on an overturned plastic bucket. Titan sat faithfully by her side, radiating comforting body heat against her shivering leg. "They know we are down here now," Brad stated plainly, checking the chamber of his captured rifle. "They will seal all the ground floor exits and send a heavily armed, coordinated squad down here to flush us out. I need to know this terrain much better than they do. What can you tell me about the layout of this specific level?" Alice took a long, deep breath, forcing her rising panic down into a small box in her mind. Her analytical brain, the strict mind of a meticulous hotel manager, finally took over. "I know every single inch of this building," Alice said, her voice growing steadily stronger. "My office upstairs has the master blueprints, but I have them completely memorized for emergency protocols. This basement connects directly to the main boiler room, the resort laundry facilities, and the chemical storage room. There is only one main corridor leading from the central stairs, but there are dozens of narrow service trenches running just under the floorboards." Brad nodded slowly, highly impressed by her sudden composure under extreme duress. "Where is the chemical storage room located?" he asked, his tactical mind already forming a strategy. Alice pointed toward a set of heavy double doors down the dark, echoing hall. 50 yards exactly that way," she replied confidently. Brad moved quickly to the chemical storage area. He broke the heavy brass padlock with a swift, powerful strike from the heavy stock of his captured rifle. Inside, the red pen light revealed neat rows of industrial cleaning supplies, concentrated bleach, pure ammonia, and medical-grade disinfectants used exclusively for the resort spa pools. Brad was not just a highly accurate shooter, he was a highly trained tactical specialist who knew exactly how to turn basic household chemicals into lethal battlefield advantages. He gathered several large plastic bottles of ammonia, a heavy red fire extinguisher, and a thick spool of copper wire he found resting on a dusty maintenance cart. He returned swiftly to the boiler room. "What are you doing with all of that?" Alice asked, watching him work with rapid, practiced movements that wasted zero energy. "I am leveling the playing field," Brad answered simply. He began to strip the thick rubber coating off the copper wire using his sharp knife. He ran the bare wire completely across the main entrance of the basement corridor, connecting one end to a large, stagnant puddle of water near a continuously leaking pipe, and the other end to a high-voltage electrical junction box he pried open on the concrete wall. He then strategically placed the bottles of ammonia near the entrance, resting them right next to the heavy fire extinguisher. Exactly 10 minutes later, the distinct rhythmic sound of heavy tactical boots echoing down the concrete stairwell reached their waiting ears. The enemy squad was rapidly approaching their position. Brad positioned Alice safely behind a thick concrete support pillar located far away from the main entrance. He ordered Titan to stay closely with her. The intelligent dog whined very softly in protest, but obeyed the command immediately, pressing his large, muscular body firmly against Alice's side. Brad took his position in the deep, impenetrable shadows near the open junction box. He watched patiently as 4 heavily armed mercenaries wearing advanced night vision goggles fanned out into the basement corridor. They moved in a tight, disciplined diamond formation, their suppressed rifles continuously scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. "Check the main boiler room first," the lead mercenary commanded softly over his secure radio channel. They stepped forward together, their heavy boots splashing directly into the large puddle of water Brad had deliberately wired. Brad did not hesitate for a single second. He jammed the thick steel blade of his combat knife directly into the exposed high-voltage junction box, forcefully completing the electrical circuit. A massive, blinding shower of blue sparks erupted violently from the wall panel. The raw electricity surged rapidly through the bare copper wire and directly into the puddle of standing water. The lead mercenary convulsed violently as the powerful current hit his body, his muscles locking up instantly in agonizing pain. He dropped like a heavy stone to the wet floor, completely incapacitated. The remaining 3 mercenaries scattered in absolute panic, firing their rifles blindly into the dark shadows. Brad snatched up the heavy metal fire extinguisher from the floor. He hurled it forcefully toward the doorway like a bowling ball. The heavy red cylinder slammed directly into the cluster of plastic ammonia bottles, shattering them instantly. A thick, suffocating cloud of toxic burning gas immediately filled the narrow corridor. The mercenaries began to cough uncontrollably, frantically tearing off their expensive night vision goggles as the harsh chemical vapor burned their eyes and lungs. Brad moved smoothly through the thick chemical smoke like a silent ghost. He held his breath tightly, relying entirely on his spatial memory and his highly trained senses. He grabbed the closest disoriented mercenary from behind, sweeping his leg out forcefully and bringing the heavy man hard to the concrete floor. A swift, brutal strike to the temple completely neutralized the threat. The 3rd mercenary spun around wildly in circles, trying desperately to aim his rifle through the burning, opaque haze. Suddenly, a low, terrifying growl echoed through the cavernous room. Titan had broken his strict stay command, sensing that his handler was in the thick of a dangerous fight. The massive German shepherd leaped out of the thick smoke, taking the 3rd mercenary down by the shoulder with devastating force. The man screamed out in pain as the heavy dog pinned him firmly to the wet ground. Brad emerged from the fog, disarming the final mercenary with a brutal palm strike directly to the chest plate, followed by a sweeping martial arts kick that sent the man crashing heavily into a solid steel pipe. The entire elite squad was neutralized in less than 60 seconds. The large basement fell completely silent once again, save for the steady hum of the water heaters. Brad whistled a sharp single note. Titan released the injured man immediately and trotted proudly back to his handler, completely unharmed by the brief scuffle. Brad quickly gathered the spare ammunition magazines and tactical radios from the unconscious men scattered on the floor. He walked slowly back to where Alice was still hiding behind the concrete pillar. She was staring at him with a complex mixture of absolute awe and lingering, deep-seated fear. She had just watched a single man and a loyal dog completely dismantle an elite combat squad using nothing but cleaning supplies, water, and the surrounding environment. "They will absolutely stop sending small teams down here now," Brad said, his voice as calm and measured as if he were discussing the weather. "They know exactly where we are holding out. The next wave will be everyone they have left in the building." Alice stood up slowly, brushing the thick dust from her manager uniform. She looked at the unconscious mercenaries on the floor, then at the Navy SEAL standing tall before her. "Then we need a much better plan," Alice said firmly, her voice finally losing its tremble. Brad offered a faint, approving nod in the darkness. The simple cat-and-mouse game was officially over. Now it was an open war. The technical basement was quiet except for the steady hum of the massive industrial water heaters and the dripping of condensation from the thick overhead pipes. Brad stood over the unconscious mercenaries, systematically stripping them of their useful gear. He secured 2 more suppressed rifles, several spare magazines, a heavy tactical flashlight, and a small medical kit. He handed the flashlight to Alice. She took it with a slightly unsteady hand, but her grip was firm. She had survived the initial shock of the violence and was quickly adapting to the harsh reality of their terrifying situation. Titan sat faithfully beside her, his ears swiveling continuously to catch any distant noises echoing down the concrete corridor. Brad picked up the lead mercenary's tactical radio and adjusted the earpiece. The device crackled with static before settling into a clear encrypted channel. He pressed a button on the side, disabling the microphone so they could listen without being detected. The voices coming through the small speaker were strained and laced with undeniable panic. The professional discipline of the mercenary unit was rapidly crumbling as the reality of their massive losses finally set in. A rough voice echoed through the earpiece, reporting that the Echo team was completely gone, and they had just lost contact with the basement sweep team. The voice explained that they found the 2 men from the kitchen severely beaten and tied up. The panicked mercenaries stated clearly that they were being hunted by a massive monster dog and a highly trained operative. Vance barked over the radio, his voice loud and harsh, attempting to regain immediate control over his terrified men. "Shut up and hold your positions," Vance commanded. "There are no ghosts. It is just 1 man and an animal. Consolidate your numbers on the ground floor. Nobody moves alone. Secure the perimeter around the lobby and the main stairwell. If you see the dog, shoot it on sight. If you see the man, light him up." Brad listened closely, analyzing the enemy's shifting tactics in his mind. They were pulling back to a defensive posture out of pure fear. This meant the upper floors were likely clear now, but all potential escape routes were heavily guarded by extremely nervous men with automatic weapons. The radio went silent for a few long moments. Then Vance spoke again, but his tone was entirely different. It was lower, much more respectful, and tight with underlying anxiety. He had switched to a secure command channel, which the squad leader's radio was luckily authorized to receive. "Sir, we have a minor complication," Vance reported. A new voice crackled through the speaker. It was smooth, arrogant, and dripping with cruel authority. The new voice identified himself as Mr. Sterling, the wealthy chief executive officer of the Grand Crest Corporation. "I am paying you an exorbitant amount of money to ensure there are 0 complications, Vance," Sterling warned. "The storm will break by morning, and the local police will eventually notice the communication blackout and send a patrol car up the mountain road. Is the server room completely destroyed?" Vance replied quickly, "The servers are melting down as we speak, Mr. Sterling. The digital footprint of your offshore accounts is entirely gone. The hotel records are wiped clean, but we have encountered unexpected resistance. A highly trained individual is inside the building and has already neutralized half of my men." Sterling scoffed loudly over the radio. "I do not care about your incompetent men. They are entirely expendable. Have you secured the primary target? Is the girl dead?" In the dark basement, Alice gasped softly, her eyes widening in absolute shock. She stared at the small radio in Brad's hand, her mind racing to comprehend the terrifying words. "We are tracking her down now," Vance assured his boss. "She is trapped in the building. She cannot escape." Sterling warned Vance that he better hope they find her quickly. "I did not transfer Alice to that isolated frozen wasteland just to let her survive," Sterling stated explicitly. "The server room destruction was merely a convenient diversion for the federal authorities. The real threat is what she is carrying. Have you retrieved the silver pendant necklace?" When Vance admitted he had not found it yet, Sterling hissed a final deadly instruction. That necklace contains a microscopic encrypted flash drive holding the original, unedited financial ledgers of the entire hospitality corporation. It proves every single instance of massive fraud, bribery, and embezzlement I have committed over the last decade. The previous chief auditor hid the drive inside that cheap piece of jewelry before he suffered his unfortunate car accident. He gave it to Alice as a farewell gift, and the foolish girl has been wearing it every day without knowing its true value. Secure the necklace and silence Alice permanently. If you fail, do not bother coming back. The radio clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Brad slowly lowered the radio and turned to look at Alice. She was completely pale. Her trembling fingers reached up to touch her collarbone. Resting against her skin was a simple, elegant silver pendant shaped like a teardrop. She had worn it every single day for the past 6 months since her beloved mentor died. He had given it to her on his last day, calling it a lucky charm to protect her on her new assignment. He knew, Alice whispered through welling tears. He knew Sterling was going to kill him. He hid the evidence in plain sight. He trusted me to keep it safe, and I did not even know. Brad stepped closer, his expression remaining perfectly calm and highly focused. The tactical landscape had completely shifted. They were no longer innocent bystanders caught in a random robbery. They were the central targets of a highly funded corporate assassination squad. The mercenaries outside would not negotiate or leave until they retrieved the necklace. "Take the necklace off," Brad instructed quietly. Alice unclasped the silver chain with shaking hands and placed the pendant in Brad's open palm. Brad inspected the heavy silver teardrop and noticed a microscopic seam running along the edge. He squeezed the metal firmly, and a tiny concealed drawer slid open, revealing a remarkably small digital storage chip. Sterling was telling the absolute truth, and the key to taking down a corrupt billionaire was resting right in his hand. Brad pushed the tiny drawer shut and placed the necklace securely into a zippered pocket on his tactical pants. He looked directly into Alice's fearful eyes. "You are no longer the target," Brad told her, his voice carrying unwavering certainty. "The necklace is the target, and I have it. Sterling wants this evidence destroyed. We are going to ensure it survives the night. We are going to hand this drive directly to the federal authorities." "How?" Alice asked, her voice shaking. "They have blocked the roads. They have cut the phone lines. They have heavily armed men guarding every exit. We are completely trapped down here." Brad picked up his captured rifle and checked the safety mechanism. "We are not going to wait for them to find us," Brad replied confidently. "Vance thinks he has us cornered in the basement. He expects us to hide in the dark or try to sneak out a back door. We are not going to do either of those things. We are going to take the fight directly to him." Titan let out a low, confident rumble, standing tall with his muscles coiled and ready for the next command. Alice's terror was slowly replaced by a hardening resolve as she wiped her tears away. She wanted justice for her murdered mentor. "What do you need me to do?" Alice asked bravely. Brad checked his spare magazines and pointed down the dark concrete hallway. "I need you to show me the fastest, quietest route to the main boiler room," Brad said. "Vance wants to play a dirty game in the dark. I am going to show him exactly what happens when you corner a Navy SEAL and a war dog in a confined space. It is time to turn up the heat." The technical basement was a labyrinth of dark shadows and humming machinery. Brad led Alice and Titan through the narrow concrete corridors. They moved quickly and silently toward the main boiler room. The massive space housed the enormous heating units for the entire Grand Crest Resort. Thick metal pipes ran along the walls and ceiling like an industrial steel web. The air inside the boiler room was suffocatingly hot and smelled strongly of rust and treated water. Brad knew this enclosed environment offered the perfect tactical advantage for a final stand. He found a secure alcove behind a massive water tank for Alice to hide in. He handed her his small penlight and instructed her to keep it completely turned off unless absolutely necessary. Alice nodded bravely. Her initial terror had hardened into a quiet, focused resolve. She was no longer just a frightened hotel manager trying to survive the terrifying night. She was the sole protector of the evidence needed to bring down the corrupt billionaire who murdered her beloved mentor. Upstairs in the main lobby, Vance was rapidly losing control of his entire operation. His elite tactical squad was decimated. He gathered his remaining 4 men, including his best marksman, a tall and ruthless operator named Cross. Vance knew his primary target was trapped somewhere in the basement levels. He also knew he could not risk losing any more of his highly paid men in a blind ambush in the dark. He ordered Cross to access the main ventilation control panel located in the security office. They were going to flush their prey out into the open. Cross bypassed the electronic locks and dumped a heavy canister of military-grade tear gas directly into the main air intake shafts feeding the basement levels. Down in the boiler room, the large metal vents set into the ceiling suddenly clattered open. A thick white chemical smoke began pouring rapidly into the hot room. The gas was acrid and burned the back of the throat instantly. Brad recognized the dangerous chemical agent immediately. He pulled his dark T-shirt up over his nose and mouth. He signaled for Alice to do the same with the collar of her uniform shirt. Titan sneezed heavily, shaking his large head as the irritating smoke filled the air around them. They could not stay hidden in the small alcove for much longer. The concentrated tear gas would completely incapacitate them in a matter of minutes. Brad looked at Alice. He saw the pure determination shining in her eyes despite the stinging smoke. Alice gestured toward the main entrance of the boiler room. She whispered softly that she could draw their attention, giving Brad the perfect opening to strike them from the shadows. Brad hesitated for a split second. Using a civilian as bait went against every protective instinct he possessed. But the situation was desperate, and he desperately needed a distraction to get past the armed men waiting right outside the heavy doors. He nodded once, offering a silent agreement. Alice stepped out bravely from behind the massive water tank. She walked deliberately toward the center of the hot room, coughing loudly as the tear gas burned her lungs. She kept her hands raised high in the air to show she was completely unarmed. "I am coming out," Alice called out, her voice echoing loudly off the concrete walls. "Please stop the gas. I have the necklace." Outside the heavy metal doors, Vance heard her desperate plea. He smiled a cold, victorious smile. He kicked the double doors open violently and stepped into the boiler room, followed closely by Cross and the 3 other heavily armed mercenaries. They wore heavy tactical gas masks, turning them into faceless mechanical monsters walking through the thick white smoke. Vance raised his suppressed rifle, aiming the barrel directly at Alice. He demanded she hand over the valuable necklace immediately. Alice took a very slow step forward, her hands shaking slightly as she reached into her empty pocket. She was intentionally buying every single second she could for Brad to make his move. High above them, perched precariously on a thick steel heating pipe, Brad waited patiently for the perfect tactical moment. The thick steam from the boiling water tanks combined with the white tear gas to create a dense, blinding fog across the room. The mercenaries were entirely focused on the young woman standing in the center of the room. They completely failed to notice the massive black shadow moving silently along the upper metal catwalk. Titan leaped fearlessly from the metal grating. The 80-pound German Shepherd crashed directly into Cross, the team marksman. The heavy impact knocked the sniper's rifle completely out of his hands. Titan clamped his powerful jaws securely onto the man's thick tactical vest, dragging him forcefully to the hard concrete floor. Absolute chaos erupted instantly. The 3 other mercenaries spun around in a panic, raising their weapons to fire at the attacking dog. Brad dropped straight down from the overhead pipe, landing squarely in the middle of the enemy formation. He moved with devastating speed and lethal precision. He grabbed the barrel of the nearest mercenary's rifle, twisting it violently out of his grip while driving a powerful elbow strike directly into the man's masked face. The mercenary crumpled to the floor immediately. Brad did not stop moving for a second. He pivoted smoothly on his heel, using the dropped rifle as a heavy metal club to strike the second man hard across the side of his tactical helmet. The sickening crack of the impact echoed loudly through the room as the second mercenary went down hard. The third man managed to raise his weapon, but Brad stepped quickly inside his guard, delivering a crippling palm strike to his chest plate, followed by a sweeping leg kick that sent the man crashing heavily into a solid wall of metal pipes. Vance realized his remaining men were falling all around him in the thick smoke. He turned his weapon toward Brad, but the Navy SEAL was already moving toward him. Brad closed the distance in a complete blur of motion. He knocked the rifle barrel aside with his left forearm and drove his right fist directly into Vance's stomach. The mercenary leader grunted heavily in pain, but quickly recovered his balance. Vance was a seasoned veteran of brutal close-quarters combat. He dropped his useless rifle and drew a heavy combat knife from his chest rig. He slashed aggressively at Brad, the sharp steel blade cutting a shallow line across Brad's forearm. Brad ignored the stinging pain entirely. He fell back quickly into a defensive stance, his eyes locked intently onto Vance's movements. The boiler room was sweltering. Thick white steam and burning tear gas swirled violently around them in the dim light. Vance lunged forward suddenly, thrusting the heavy knife straight toward Brad's chest. Brad sidestepped the lethal attack with smooth, practiced agility. He grabbed Vance's wrist with both of his hands, twisting the joint sharply outward. Vance roared loudly in anger and tried to break the painful hold, but Brad's grip was like solid iron. Brad used Vance's own forward momentum against him. He pulled the mercenary leader forward while sweeping his leg forcefully out from under him. Vance crashed heavily onto the hard concrete floor, losing his grip on the heavy combat knife completely. Vance scrambled desperately to get back to his feet, but Brad was already standing tall over him. Brad delivered a final, devastating kick directly to the side of Vance's head. The mercenary leader's eyes rolled back, and his body went entirely limp on the floor. The violent fight was finally over. The massive boiler room grew eerily quiet, save for the steady hiss of escaping steam and the harsh, ragged breathing of the survivors. Brad stood tall amidst the fallen mercenaries, his chest heaving deeply as the combat adrenaline slowly drained from his system. He looked over at Titan. The German shepherd was sitting calmly beside the unconscious marksman, keeping a highly vigilant watch over the prisoner. Brad then turned his attention to Alice. She was leaning heavily against a metal support beam, coughing violently from the residual tear gas, but she was completely unharmed. The deadly threat was entirely neutralized. The long, terrifying night was finally coming to an end. The dense white smoke in the boiler room began to clear slowly as the heavy ventilation fans kicked back to full capacity following the stabilization of the emergency backup power. Brad moved methodically through the hot, humid room. He used heavy plastic zip ties from his tactical gear to securely bind the hands and feet of Vance and the remaining unconscious mercenaries. Titan sat nearby, his posture rigid and attentive. The large German shepherd watched the defeated men with highly alert amber eyes, ensuring absolutely none of them made a sudden or aggressive movement. Alice leaned against the cold concrete wall of the mechanical alcove. She took deep, shuddering breaths of the clearing air. The terrifying ordeal of the past few hours finally caught up to her completely. Her legs trembled weakly, and she slid down the rough wall to sit on the hard floor. Brad finished securing the last mercenary and walked over to her. He extended a strong, calloused hand. Alice took it, and he pulled her gently to her feet. "It is over," Brad said quietly, his voice carrying a soothing certainty. "They will not hurt you or anyone else tonight." Alice nodded slowly. Her hand instinctively reached for the pocket where Brad had safely stowed the silver pendant. She realized Brad still possessed it. Brad reached into his tactical pants and pulled out the teardrop necklace. He placed it carefully into her palm, closing her fingers over the metal. "This belongs to you," Brad told her. "You are the one who is going to finish this fight and bring him down." Alice held the cold silver tightly. The residual fear in her heart was entirely replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of duty. She was going to make absolutely sure Sterling paid for his crimes and for the murder of her mentor. Brad led the way out of the technical basement. They walked up the main concrete stairwell, stepping over the scattered equipment of the defeated men. Titan walked closely by Alice's side. The dog offered a comforting physical presence, his thick fur brushing gently against her hand with every step. They reached the ground floor and pushed open the heavy wooden doors leading into the main lobby. The scene was chaotic. The beautiful Grand Crest Resort was heavily damaged. Shattered security glass covered the expensive carpets like sparkling ice. The antique grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silent, empty space. The severe storm outside had finally broken. The howling winds subsided into a gentle morning breeze. The very first light of dawn crept slowly over the distant mountain peaks, casting a soft golden glow through the broken floor to ceiling windows. The dark, terrifying shadows of the night rapidly retreated. Brad walked over to the front reception desk. He found the bodies of the two night security guards, Marcus and Dave, lying in the back office. They were badly bruised and tightly bound, but they were breathing steadily. Brad quickly cut their plastic ties with his sharp combat knife. Marcus groaned painfully and opened his swollen eyes, looking up at the Navy SEAL in absolute confusion. "Stay down and rest," Brad assured the injured guard in a steady tone. "The active threat is completely neutralized. Medical help will be here shortly." Brad moved to the main security console behind the mahogany desk. He located the sophisticated electronic jamming device the Mercenaries had planted near the central communication router. He smashed the small black box effortlessly with the heavy stock of his captured rifle. Almost instantly, the main lobby telephone began to ring loudly, the shrill sound cutting sharply through the morning silence. The connection to the outside world was officially restored. Alice picked up the receiver with a shaking hand. She spoke directly to the county emergency dispatcher, explaining the severe situation as clearly and concisely as possible. She told them about the armed intruders, the injured security staff, the destroyed server room, and the absolute need for immediate medical assistance and heavily armed police backup. The dispatcher assured her that multiple local police units, emergency medical technicians, and a specialized tactical SWAT team were already navigating the treacherous winding mountain road to reach the isolated resort. Alice hung up the phone and looked out through the shattered glass of the front entrance. The faint sound of distant sirens echoed softly down the Blackwood Valley. The wailing noise grew steadily louder and more distinct with every passing minute, signaling the definitive end of their long nightmare. Brad stood quietly near the main entrance, watching the approaching lights. He unslung the captured rifle from his shoulder, cleared the loaded chamber, and placed the weapon carefully on the polished tile floor. He knelt down and gave Titan a firm, affectionate rub behind the ears. The massive German shepherd wagged his tail slowly, completely relaxed now that his protective duty was fulfilled. Brad took off his heavy gray military jacket. He walked over to Alice and draped the warm fabric gently over her shivering shoulders to ward off the morning chill. The jacket was heavy and smelled faintly of pine needles and cold mountain air. "You did incredibly well tonight," Brad told her. His voice was calm, measured, and deeply respectful of the bravery she had shown. "Your mentor would be very proud of the courage you displayed. You protected his legacy." Alice pulled the military jacket tight around her body, feeling a sudden wave of immense relief wash over her. A single warm tear slipped down her cheek. "I could not have survived any of this without you," Alice replied softly, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "I do not even know your last name to thank you properly." Brad simply smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. He looked out toward the rising sun illuminating the dense pine forest. "You do not need to know it," Brad answered softly. "Just make sure you give that silver pendant to the highest federal authority you can find. Make sure Sterling answers for every single thing he did." 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue emergency lights of multiple police cruisers and armored transport vehicles illuminated the entire resort driveway. Heavily armed police officers poured out of the vehicles, setting up a secure perimeter around the building. A tactical SWAT commander named Captain Miller entered the lobby first. Captain Miller was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s with closely cropped graying hair, a stern jawline, and sharp blue eyes that scanned the room critically. He held his standard-issue weapon at a low-ready position as his specialized team flooded the expansive room to secure the immediate area. "Are you the night manager?" Captain Miller asked, approaching Alice with cautious steps. Alice nodded firmly, stepping out from behind the reception desk. She held out the silver teardrop pendant, her grip tight and resolute. "My name is Alice. I have direct digital evidence of massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, and premeditated murder committed by the chief executive officer of this corporation," Alice stated clearly, leaving no room for doubt. "The armed men who attacked this hotel are currently tied up in the technical boiler room downstairs. There are several more incapacitated mercenaries scattered throughout the upper guest floors and the maintenance wings. The building is secure." Captain Miller looked at the young woman in absolute astonishment. He looked at the massive shattered glass doors, the captured military-grade weapons resting on the floor, and the sheer unbelievable scale of the tactical takedown that had occurred before his arrival. "You neutralized a team of highly trained professional operators all by yourself?" the seasoned captain asked in pure disbelief, signaling for his medical team to tend to the injured security guards. Alice shook her head immediately. She turned around to point to the brave soldier and his loyal working dog who had single-handedly saved everyone in the valley. "No," Alice said, her voice filled with immense pride and deep gratitude. "A quiet man named Brad and his German shepherd named Titan saved us. They fought them all in the dark." Alice looked toward the front entrance where Brad had just been standing moments ago. The space was completely empty. She rushed quickly to the broken windows and looked out into the misty morning air. The Navy SEAL and the massive German shepherd were entirely gone. They had vanished seamlessly into the dense, foggy pine forest without making a single sound. The only proof they were ever there was the warm military jacket resting securely on Alice's shoulders, the captured men waiting for swift justice down below, and the profound silence of a new day. The quiet hero had returned to the shadows, leaving behind a powerful legacy of immense courage and selfless sacrifice that Alice would remember and honor for the rest of her life. The events at the Grand Crest Resort remind us that true heroism does not always announce its arrival. Sometimes the most extraordinary courage is found in the quietest individuals, like a man seeking peace and his loyal canine companion. Brad and Titan did not seek out a battle, but when innocent lives were threatened, they did not hesitate to stand in the gap. Their actions teach us that standing up against corruption and protecting the vulnerable is a duty we all share, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Alice also showed us that bravery comes in many forms, and honoring the truth is worth fighting for. May this story inspire you to find the quiet strength within yourself and to always stand up for what is right. We hope you found this tale of bravery and loyalty as inspiring as we did. If this story moved you, please take a moment to share it with your friends and family. Leave a comment below telling us your favorite moment of Brad and Titan's incredible teamwork. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life inspired stories of courage and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals.